Hello everyone. I am so excited that we are starting our One Book, One School again this year. This year's book is Mysteries According to Humphrey, and as you may know, Humphrey is a hamster. This book is, the author is Betty G. Burney, and I'm going to start by reading chapter 1 out loud to you. If you have a book and you want to follow along in your book, you can follow along. If you just want to listen, you can do that too. Chapter 1 is called The Case of the Mysterious Detective. Outside, the sun was shining, but inside room 26 of Longfellow School, it was a dark and stormy night. Mrs. Brisbane, our teacher, was reading us a fur-raising mystery story from a big red book. A mystery is like a puzzle. It can be something unsqueakably scary, like a thing that goes thump in the night. Or a mystery can be something ordinary, like what happened to Mrs. Brisbane's glasses. Sometimes our teacher can't find her glasses when they're right on her head. Even though my classmates and I read by ourselves, we love having Mrs. Brisbane read to us. It is surprising that I can read because I am the classroom hamster, but I am also smart, if I do say so myself. As I listened, I climbed up to the tippy top of my cage and looked out at my classmates. When school started in September, they were all mysteries to me. I didn't realize that at the beginning of the school year, a new class comes in, a class of total strangers. It's taken me a while to figure out why Hurry Up Harry is late so often and why Slow Down Simon moves so fast. I learned that Rolling Rosie's wheelchair doesn't slow her down a bit. And I learned that Helpful Holly is sometimes too helpful Holly. Now it's October. I'm still getting to know some of the students who sit on the opposite side of the room from my cage. I haven't figured out why Do It Now Daniel D. always puts things off, and why Stop Talking Sophie Kaminsky has so much trouble being quiet. In time, I hope I'll solve those mysteries too. I guess being a classroom hamster is a lot like being a detective. A detective is someone who solves mysteries. The story Mrs. Brisbane was reading was about a detective named Sherlock Holmes, who was one smart human. In his picture on the cover of the red book, he wore a strange-looking hat. Mrs. Brisbane said it was called a deerstalker hat. She also said he sometimes played the violin to help him think, which made me wish I had a violin of my own. There were a lot of stories in the book. This puzzling mystery had to do with a man with flaming red hair named Mr. Jabez Wilson. He came to Sherlock Holmes and explained something strange that had happened to him. It started when he saw an ad in the newspaper for a job that was only for a person with flaming red hair. I guess that's why the name of the story was The Adventure of the Red-Headed League. Mrs. Brisbane asked us, why would they only want someone with red hair? Kelsey Kirkpatrick's hand shot up so fast she almost hit just Joey, who sat next to her. Please be careful, Kelsey, Mrs. Brisbane said. So what do you think? Kelsey said, they must be looking for somebody smart. Everybody knows that redheads are the smartest people. My classmates all laughed because Kelsey has red hair. Naturally, she would think red-haired people are the smartest. Mrs. Brisbane laughed too. Yes, Kelsey, some red-haired people are very smart, but I don't think that was the reason. She asked if we had any other ideas. I thought and thought. If the job needed someone smart, I think they might look for a clever hamster like me. Paul Fletcher, whom I think of as Small Paul, had another idea. Maybe they needed someone who looked like someone else, a different person with red hair, he suggested. That's an interesting idea, Paul. You'd make a good detective, Mrs. Brisbane said. Paul Green, whom I think of as Tall Paul, raised his hand. Maybe the person has to wear a costume, he suggested, and they need red hair to go with the costume. Excellent idea, Mrs. Brisbane said. Thomas T. True looked puzzled, and he raised his hand. Is this a true story, he asked. I mean, is Sherlock Holmes a real person? Mrs. Brisbane smiled. No, it's a made-up story, but Sherlock Holmes almost seems like a real person, and he's been popular for many years. When he solves a mystery, he looks for clues. She explained that a clue is information that helps you solve a mystery. And Sherlock Holmes was always looking for clues because a good detective always has to be sharp-eyed. Mrs. Brisbane read some more. The red-haired man got hired, but it turned out that the job was nothing more than copying out the encyclopedia every evening. What a strange job. Why would anyone need someone to copy the encyclopedia? And why would the person have to have red hair? This was a mystery indeed. Suddenly, Mrs. Brisbane stopped reading and closed the book. Eek! I squeaked. My classmates all groaned and begged her to read more, but it was almost time for afternoon recess. When you come back, I'll have a different kind of mystery for you, she said, which got us all excited again. Soon the classroom was empty except for Og the Frog and me. Classroom pets like us don't get to go outside for recess. Once we were alone, I squeaked to my neighbor who lives in a tank next to my cage. Og, why do you think that ad asked for someone with red hair? He splashed around a little in the water side of his tank, and then he leaped up and said, boing, boing. He sounds like a broken guitar string, but he can't help it. It's just the sound he makes. I guess Og doesn't know very much about red hair. He doesn't have any hair or fur at all, and he's very, very, very green. I don't have any ideas either, I said, but I'm sure going to think about it. When my friends came back, they were anxious to hear about the other mystery. You know, class, when we read, we're all detectives, the teacher said. We all looked puzzled. Sometimes we come across a word we don't know, right? She asked. Everyone nodded, including me. So to figure out what the word means, we look for a clue, Mrs. Brisbane continued, just like Sherlock Holmes. Try this sentence. Then Mrs. Brisbane wrote something very mysterious on the board. She wrote, the twins looked so much alike, I was pie-whacked when I tried to tell them apart. Pie-whacked? That word had never been on our vocabulary list. Lots of my friends giggled when they saw the word. Who knows what pie-whacked means? Mrs. Brisbane asked. Thomas raised his hand. I think it means hit someone in the face with a pie. Everybody laughed, including me, but that didn't make much sense in the sentence about the twins. Let's try again, Mrs. Brisbane said. She wrote another sentence. The rules of soccer can be very pie-whacking if you've never seen a game before. This time, more students giggled. Pie-whacked? Pie-whacking? What was she trying to say? Were the pies flying at the soccer game? Look at how the word is used in the sentences to get some clues, she told us. Mrs. Brisbane wrote one more sentence on the board. When the teacher put the wrong answers on the board, there was a lot of pie-waction in the classroom. Pie-waction? Was there a pie fight in the classroom, or had my teacher lost her mind? I'm confused, I blurted out, even though all that my human friends heard was squeak. Confusion, Slow Down Simon shouted. I'm sorry to say he forgot to raise his hand before speaking. Confused, Too Helpful Holly said. She raised her hand, but she didn't wait for the teacher to call on her before speaking. Let's see if that word works, Mrs. Brisbane said with a smile. The twins looked so much alike, I was confused when I tried to tell them apart. That worked for me. How about, the rules of soccer can be very confusing if you've never seen a game before, she continued. And finally, when the teacher put the wrong answers on the board, there was a lot of confusion in the classroom. Now I was positive that pie-whack meant confuse. For your homework tonight, here are 5 more mystery words to figure out, she said as she handed Rolling Rosie the homework sheets to pass out. Unfortunately, Rosie didn't give me one, so I couldn't see what the mystery words were. I tried making up my own mystery words like flapple and scarret, but they just made me hungry. At the end of the day, just before the bell rang, the door to room 26 swung open, and in walked Mrs. Wright, the physical education teacher. She was clutching a pink jacket, and as usual, she wore a shiny silver whistle on a cord around her neck. Mrs. Wright likes to blow that whistle, and when she does, it makes my ears wiggle and the fur on my neck stand up. It's loud, loud, loud. way too loud for the small, sensitive ears of a hamster. Mrs. Wright also likes rules. Okay, she loves rules. I can understand why someone who teaches children to play games would love rules, because rules are very important to games. But to squeak the truth, I think she loves rules just a tiny bit too much, and I think Mrs. Brisbane agrees with me. Yes, Mrs. Wright? Our teacher asked. Mrs. Wright raised the pink jacket up high. I believe this belongs to one of your students, she said. Normally I would put it in the lost and found in my office, but her name was inside and I thought she might need it. It's quite chilly out there. Phoebe Pratt? Poor forgetful Phoebe looked embarrassed as she walked over to get the jacket. Sorry, Mrs. Wright, she said. Students must be responsible for their belongings, Mrs. Wright said. You'd be amazed at what treasures I have found in the lost and found. Thank you, Mrs. Wright, Mrs. Brisbane replied. Mrs. Wright paused at the door and fingered her whistle. I steeled myself for a loud blast, but luckily she walked out the door silently. Thomas T. True waved his hand and Mrs. Brisbane called on him. Don't go to that lost and found, he said. I went there last year and it was a very scary place. Now what was scary about it? Mrs. Brisbane asked. Thomas's eyes grew wide. There were creepy things like spider webs and claws. I felt a shiver. Some of my classmates giggled. Oh, and a dead snake. Thomas stopped and thought. Maybe it was alive, and I'm pretty sure I saw a severed hand. I felt a quiver. There were gasps and more giggles, and some of my friends went, ew! Mrs. Brisbane walked between the tables toward Thomas. Are you sure that's true? Yes, ma'am, he said. At least that's what I remember. Well, I don't think Mrs. Wright would keep any of those things in her lost and found, Mrs. Brisbane said. Maybe you just imagined it. Thomas thought for a second. Maybe, but I don't think so. Suddenly the bell rang and my friends jumped up from their chairs. Slow Down Simon was the first one out the door and my other friends were close behind him. After all of my classmates had left room 26, Mrs. Wright came back in. That Phoebe is quite forgetful, she said. Have you noticed? Yes, I have. We're working on it, Mrs. Brisbane said. I'd certainly figured out that Phoebe had a problem remembering things like homework and lunches, but I hadn't figured out why. All I really knew about Phoebe was that she lived with her grandmother, who seemed like an unsqueakably nice human. Mrs. Wright nodded politely and headed for the door, but before she left she turned and said, Please try to encourage your students to visit the Lost and Found. It's right in my office inside the gym. I'll do that, Mrs. Brisbane said. Mrs. Brisbane tidied up her desk for a few minutes. Then she wandered over to the table where Og and I live, next to the window. Have a good night, fellows, she said. I hope today wasn't too pie-whacking for you. See you in the morning. She laughed and then left, just like on any other day. See you in the morning, that's what she said. I remember it so well. Later that night, Aldo came in to clean the classroom as he does every night. Never fear, Aldo's here, he boomed. Then he laughed, which made his big furry mustache shake. He went right to work, moving the tables and sweeping the floors, humming a happy-sounding song. When he got close to Mrs. Brisbane's desk, he stopped and picked up the red book. Hey, Sherlock Holmes, I love these stories, he said, thumbing through the pages. I remember that one about the red-headed guy. Tell me what happens, I shouted. Even Og splashed around in his tank. Boing, boing, he twanged. Sorry, I don't have time to read it to you, he told us. Too bad you can't read it yourself. Aldo probably knows me better than any of my human friends, but even he doesn't know that I can read. It's not easy for a small hamster to read a big, big, big book. That's why I like it when Mrs. Brisbane reads to us. I decided I could wait until the next day to hear her read more of the Red-Headed League. But it was nice to know that Aldo liked Sherlock Holmes as much as I do. After Aldo left, the room was silent. Og didn't splash. He didn't even say boing. What was he thinking about? We're good friends, but Og will always be a mystery to me. Humans are also very mysterious to me. I've learned a lot about them, but there are still so many things I don't understand. I took out the little notebook I keep hidden behind my mirror and started scribbling in it with my tiny pencil. Mysteries about humans. Why do they keep odd and unpleasant pets like dogs and cats when they could have a very nice hamster like me? Why do they throw bits of leftover food away when they could store it like I do, in my bedding or in my cheek pouch? Where are humans' cheek pouches? Why do humans laugh when they talk about poo, especially my poo? Mysteries about frogs. Why don't frogs have fur or even hair? Why can't frogs act just a little bit more like hamsters? I wasn't sure those mysteries would ever be solved. Humphrey's Detectionary. Even smart detectives like Sherlock Holmes can't solve a mystery without a clue. That's the end of chapter 1.